As we look at the work of life repair today, I want to invite you to think back on the ups and downs of your life experience and to see how these are echoed in the great green world around us. Trees, for example, can look back on times of ecstasy and grief in their own lives, even as we do. And I have found trees to be some of the most important teachers in my life. The whole of the natural world participates with us in an exuberant dance of delight and a mournful cry of anguish. We see it everywhere today. And if we can learn that our lives are inseparably related to the earth, that we thrive and we hurt with one another, there's nothing we can't get through together. So what I want to do is to take this first half hour or so to share with you some slides and thoughts about how our life repair and that of trees might be related. I am intrigued by how the life of every tree is encoded in the core of its being. You can read it in the rings of its heartwood, everything that it's been through, how old it is, what the weather was like in every year of its life. It's a terrific symbol of how we can make a review of our own lives. And it reminds us that the work of individual repair has to be part of the larger life repair of the planet today. Now, a tree has two growth periods every year, so that its ring for that year appears in two parts. First, there's a wider, light-colored section showing its fast growth in spring and early summer. And then there's a narrower, dark section showing a slower growth in the fall. If a tree's had a stressful year, both sections will be very thin, maybe marked with a black scar due to fire. In this tree, for example, you can see on the left some 20 years of dry weather and struggle before and then shortly after a fire, followed by 20 years of relatively wet weather and growth with wide rings on the right side. And it's the same with us. We can look back on periods of stress caused by spells of depression or illness and family death. And we can also trace times of tremendous vitality when life was full. Sometimes the two come close together, in fact, as if the dry spells were necessary for subsequent growth. Ignatius Loyola spoke of these ups and downs in the spiritual life as times of consolation and desolation, continually recurring in our experience. Now, there's been one particular tree in my life that I've known intimately for the last 30 years. I call him Grandfather. He's a 100-year-old male cottonwood tree living in the park near my house. I go there every night to lean into his hollow and practice contemplation. He stands 90 feet tall with about 150,000 heart-shaped leaves rustling in the wind on a summer evening. There's a grand majesty to his leafy crown rising above everything else in the park. And yet, as I approach the tree from his other side, there's a massive 12-foot-high wound, and that's where I pray. 30 years ago, he was struck by lightning, taking down one of the two great trunks that grew from his roots. We met at that time, when death had struck in my own life as well. It was a common hurt that drew us to each other. Isn't that interesting? We've been through a lot together, this tree and I. The hard and good times are all there, like the gift of my granddaughter, Ellie, who I introduced to the tree very early from the beginning. She's been one of the greatest gifts in my life. She calls me Babu, as you see here. The tree ring that represents her birth 6 years ago, that tree ring within me, is a wide and beautiful one. But there's another ring added a little over 2 years ago that represents the death of her daddy, my son John, who died of cancer at the age of 41. This is a dark, jagged, and narrow ring inside me. So as I share today, ecstasy and grief are both close to me. Some trees have long been considered sacred by indigenous traditions. Cottonwoods, for example, are revered by the Lakota people of the American Plains. Black Elk saw a cottonwood tree in his life-defining vision when he was just 9 years old. The Lakota say these trees are praying when their leaves whisper in the slightest breeze. Cottonwoods are taller than other trees and more susceptible to lightning strike as a result. So consequently, their spiritual power is due as much to their vulnerability as to their splendor. The gifts grandfather offers include a vast capacity for praise and a deep familiarity with pain. That makes for a great teacher. The tall standing ones are always inviting us to share in a green outpouring of the heart. They open us up to times of praise when we exult in everything around us, and times of lament when we cry out of the depths. These are two dominant forms of prayer found throughout the Psalms in the Hebrew Bible and shared across the boundaries of the human and more than human world as well. And yet we as men in our culture have been taught to suppress spontaneous praise and adoration as something maybe women and children do. We're allowed to express lament only in the form of anger, usually, not in the venting of tears. Throughout our lives, we old men have taught to hold it all in. But I've learned from this tree that our earliest form of prayer is a spontaneous childlike wonder at the ordinary. Sitting in grandfather's hollow here, I will think of poet Christian Wyman's walking with his grandmother across the fields of their West Texas farm. And now and then she'd stop to finger a common weed, crabgrass, creosote, dandelion. And she'd say, "Oh, law, honey, ain't this a praiseful thing?" That's prayer in all of its stark simplicity and spontaneity. "Oh, law, honey, ain't this a praiseful thing?" At other times, I'll sit with grandfather remembering a handful of men suffering from cancer, gathered at the foot of a tree in the Pacific Northwest. His trunk was covered with large, ugly protrusions, knobby burls caused by bacteria, viruses, or insects. The men were weeping as they recognized in the tree's unnatural growth the plight of their own bodies. And this too is prayer, grandfather assures me. A lament shared across species, mourning what can't be changed. From this tree, I've learned the power of prayer as praise and lament. Now, one form of prayer that grandfather and I both find hard to embrace is praying for miraculous intervention in our lives. Trees have a Zen-like detachment from any thought of receiving special treatment. They're good at accepting whatever comes. Just stand there, grandfather says. Whatever you really need will come to you. Grandfather can't go anywhere for what he requires, and trying to change the weather does no good. So he simply waits, having no thought of asking for an interruption of the laws of nature. Over the last 2 years since John's death, I too have wondered, should I, any more than grandfather, ask God to stop the world in my singular case? Make an exception this time, Lord. Let other children die, but not my son. Can I, in fairness, pray for an exemption from what others have to endure? Do I really want to separate myself from the community of other wounded people? These are the kinds of questions that come up when you're praying with trees. Now, there's sacred trees in every wisdom tradition, of course. The Bodhi tree, a huge fig tree in northern India where the Buddha sat for 40 days waiting for enlightenment. And there are massive baobab trees in Africa regarded with awe because they hold the spirits of the dead. The Bible, coming at it from my own Christian tradition, begins with the tree of life and ends with the tree of paradise in the New Jerusalem, its leaves meant for the healing of nations. Jesus is depicted in Christian art as the tree of life, crucified on a cross growing from a great tree rooted in the earth. An 8th century Irish poet observed that on Good Friday, a fierce stream of blood boiled until the bark of every tree was red. There was blood throughout the world in the tops of every great wood. The trees everywhere felt the power of this death. You see, trees exemplify the power of life and death because they exhibit it so readily in their own being. The vitality of life and the pathos of pain. Think of the trees in our time, for example, that are renowned for their witness to the tenacity of life. Methuselah is a 4,853-year-old bristlecone pine in the White Mountains of California, possibly the oldest tree in the world. Twisted and weather-beaten, its stubborn beauty is astounding. In Somerset, England, Celtic pilgrims make their way to a holy thorn tree. Legend has it that Joseph of Arimathea brought the Holy Grail there after the death of Christ. On arriving, he thrust his staff into the ground where it rooted and grew into the Glastonbury thorn. Other travelers make their way to the town of Kildare in Ireland, where a hawthorn tree stands beside the holy well of St. Bridget. This is one of many wishing trees or clootie trees on which people hang colorful rags or clooties requesting prayers or making wishes. These are all trees honored for their witness to hope. They drive you to wonder and reverence. But there are other trees that bear the weight of pain. They survive as poignant symbols of loss. These include the survivor tree, a calorie pair that endured the attack in the World Trade Center on 9/11. A 200-foot tall redwood tree named Luna stands on a hillside in Northern California. Julia Butterfly Hill spent 2 years living in its branches to protect the tree from being cut down in the late 1990s. But after Pacific Lumber agreed to save the tree, its trunk was nearly cut in half by an angry logger. The tree still lives, held together by steel braces and cables. Yet another example is the children's tree, a silver maple planted by children in the Nazi concentration camp at Theresienstadt on the Jewish Tree Festival of Tu B'Shavat in 1943. The children didn't survive, but the tree remains. And most telling of all is the Chankiri tree near Phnom Penh in Cambodia. It's a massive oak where the Khmer Rouge smashed the heads of babies in the genocidal massacres of the 1970s. People still weave woven bracelets, leave them on its trunk to honor the dead. These are trees that carry in their bodies the memory of deep suffering. Like so many hanging trees used for the lynching of Black Americans across this land. These are trees that drive you to tears. Trees by their nature point to the two halves of life's mystery: God's investment in creation and redemption, in the beautiful and the begrimed. Dancing gracefully with the wind backlit by the sun, trees suggest a grandeur that is more than their own. Vulnerable to lightning strike and the terror of fire, they know also the charred wisdom of burnt limbs. Trees pray then in their own right, shouting glory as they dance in the wind and crying out for justice as they rise from the rubble of the city of Mariupol in Ukraine today. It's important for us to recognize that we pray not just for the earth, but along with it. We're all part of an interdependent community, caught up together in giving praise and groaning in travail. Today more than ever. And yet we have too often turned our backs on this larger community. William Blake complained that the tree, which moves some to tears of joy, is in the eyes of others only a green thing that stands in the way. We have to go back to earlier appreciations of trees in Celtic spirituality, Native American thought, and indigenous traditions around the world. Even the Hebrew Bible is full of references to the earth's inclusion in litanies of praise and lament. Prayer is clearly, in so many various traditions, an interspecies reality. In the book of Revelation, the Apostle John hears every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and on the sea and all that is in them singing praise. In Psalm 148, the poet exhorts fruit trees and all cedars to praise the Lord along with wild animals and flying birds. Isaiah 55 proclaims that in the world beyond Babylonian captivity, the mountains and the hills will burst into song, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. And in Psalm 96, the trees of the woods sing before the Lord with joy as he comes to judge the earth. Now, in this understanding of praise, human beings are but a single section of an enormous orchestra. I loved it. With our brother Kona from Germany was it who mentioned that earlier. A orchestra more varied and colorful than anything we can imagine. It's filled with trees of every sort, with wind rushing through their branches like the sound of a great spring section, with wolves and coyotes sounding off in the horn section, with whales breaching and elephants stampeding in the percussion section, with blackbirds and sparrows joining the piccolos and flutes high above it all. It is wonderful, that world out there, so alive. But at the same time, this vast company of prayer also pours it out in a vast dirge-like expression of pain and grief. Here is the orchestra, and here is the mourning, the grief. The land cries out in anguish at what it has to endure. The earth mourns and withers, says the prophet Isaiah in chapter 24. The world languishes, lying polluted under its inhabitants. Jeremiah asks in chapter 12, how long must the land cry out in mourning? The prophet Joel, in his first chapter, even lists the suffering of particular trees. The fig tree is withered, the pomegranate, palm, and apple tree. All the fields of the field are dried up. The ground itself bewails the sin of its people, we read in Job 31. It cries against them, its furrows wet with tears. Now, I want to argue that this is more than simply metaphor. We shouldn't dismiss this language as primitive and naive. It's the sensitivity of an agrarian consciousness. Authors who live close to the land, akin to farmers and field workers who work in harmony with the earth. Like Wendell Berry, they've worked and sung and wept with it all their lives, so they write with dirt under their fingernails. They know that everything is interlinked with everything else, the land and its people. It isn't hard for us to imagine the earth crying out in anguish today. The Pacific Ocean chokes on a 600,000 square mile area of swirling plastic waste. The Amazon rainforest, home to 15,000 different species of trees, has been cut or burnt at a rate of 20,000 square miles a year. Polar ice caps are melting at a rate of 10% per decade. At a time like this, our work on life review and life repair has to involve all of these others as well. Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, calls us to honor this vast, mysterious, and living world as our common home. We're obliged to listen to the others who belong to the same household as ours, including the trees, the animals, the oceans, the stars. He says we need to turn what's happening to the world into our own personal suffering and to see the deep joy of the earth that is ours to share as well. Sometimes there is a charm and playfulness that's involved in our standing alongside the rest of the world's creatures in shared longing and hope. I love it when Ellie and I pass by grandfather on our way to the playground, and she says, listen, Babu, he's talking to us, as the leaves flutter in the wind with our passing. There's a story that Eastern Orthodox theologian Callistus Ware tells about monks on Mount Athos being interrupted in their prayers one morning by the croaking of frogs in a cistern outside their chapel. One of the monks went out to scold them, saying, "Frogs, we've just finished the midnight office and are about to start matins. Would you mind keeping quiet until we're finished?" To which the frogs responded, "We've just finished matins and are about to begin the first hour. Would you mind keeping quiet until we're done?" Both groups, we're told, eventually compromised by praying together, "Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, gribbet, 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 gribbet." If there's laughter that joins us, brothers, there's also a shared anguish that increasingly draws us together in these days. I think of Arrow Mountain in the Wind River Range of Wyoming, for example. It's a place I love. I've often been up to that 11,000-foot peak, sitting among the old twisted white bark pine trees that grew at tree line. These were wise old trees, 400, 500 years old, that had endured incredible hardship. They had stories to tell. They were great teachers for me. But the last time I went up 4 years ago, they were all dead. Rising temperatures had brought bark beetles higher than ever before, and they killed every tree. I sat there and simply cried. We are experiencing loss like this as never before, over and over again today. Sometimes I wonder, out of my own faith tradition, we all wonder, out of whatever deep mythic life we share, what goes on inside the heart of God in times like these? Does God weep as well? Of course God does, I have to say. The doctrine of the Trinity in my tradition assures Christians of the overwhelming compassion that flows from the very center of God's heart. The early church told us that at the core of the divine being, there's a pulsing, irrepressible longing to love. It dances back and forth as God, the Father, Mother, breaks into laughter at seeing the Son mirroring back that love and the Spirit whirling around them with a bubbling exuberance. The Greek fathers even use the word perichoresis to describe what happens when inside God's heart. It means literally dancing around. And out of this churning love and dance comes an impulse to create, to make still more things to love, to widen the dance. This is what the essence of God is like. And yet, as God looks out onto a world filled with suffering and pain, this dance of life and creation and vitality moves into a deep sadness, a rocking back and forth as God grieves, longing to enter into the brokenness of God's world. And God does that too. In the great myth that I live by, God sends God's Son to embrace the agony of the cross, to suffer with, to eventually turn that suffering into the hope of resurrection. Some of you remember the familiar song, The Lord of the Dance, where Jesus sings in the last verse, "I danced on Friday when the sky turned black. It's hard to dance with the devil on your back. They buried my body and they thought I'd gone, but I am the dance and I still go on." I have to believe that, brothers. Isn't it interesting how the various things we grieve, whether it's the death of a forest or the death of a child, they have a way of sliding together into one. There's comfort as we join with all the other creatures in a common yearning, knowing how each of the hurt places want to be loved. So if prayer is an interspecies reality, cutting across boundaries that keep us separate, it's important to recognize how trees reach out to each other and to us as well. Tree scientists are telling us today that trees do everything in community. 5 years ago, in his international bestseller, The Hidden Life of Trees, Peter Wohlleben showed how trees connect through intricate social networks, actively communicating with each other. Their roots are connected by tiny threads of mycorrhizal fungi, and these help the tree absorb water and nitrogen from the soil, and in turn, allow the fungi to draw nutrients from the tree for its own use. This symbiotic relationship enables the trees to share food and water with other trees nearby, and even to send warning signals across the network about coming infestations of insects or disease. So trees exercise a kind of intelligence, cooperating, making decisions, acting on what they've learned. They just do it together. For many years, biologists thought that trees competed with each other for sunlight and nutrients, preferring to grow alone. But the new science emphasizes that across the whole fabric of creation, collaboration is at least as important as competition, if not more so. Trees teach us that a rugged individualism is as dangerous as it is impossible. Nothing thrives apart from the system in which it grows. We are what we are only in relationship to each other. No one stands alone. So trees invite us to participate in this larger community that reaches across species boundaries. When we voice together a common joy and sorrow, we create a new reality. That's why Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann says the interspecies worship of the Psalms is a world-making event. It not only declares God to be God, but calls into being the world God requires. The world, if you will, is remade each time the liturgy is reenacted. Psalm 104, for example, is a liturgical reenactment of Genesis 1. Through its ritual performance of praise, the world is reconstituted, a new reality called into being once again. Those of us in the Lumen know the power of ritual in our lives. So Brueggemann says that all the Psalms ought to be sung, some of them in joyous exultation, others in a mournful dirge, breaking into wailing complaint. The Psalms of Lament, in fact, make up a full third of the Psalter, 50 out of the total 150. In their agonizing cries, the faithful name the structures that bind them and call on God to undermine the powers that oppress. Consequently, there is a world dismantling quality about these particular Psalms. Evil is named for what it is. Hope is reaffirmed in a God of creation who triumphs in the end. Brueggemann recognized, in fact, that these lament psalms can be socially and politically dangerous. They lead us to protest. The venting of pain always makes room for bold acts of faith, calling for radical change. That's why Pharaoh disallowed the public expression of lament. He knew there can be trouble, John Lewis's kind of trouble, when the poor cry of suffering is heard in the land. There is work for us to do today as men in claiming the world we want for our children and grandchildren. It will grow naturally out of the joy and grief to which we give ourselves. But one thing is clear. The impulse of prayer in our day has to take us not up and away to a heavenly sphere, but down and among. Our prayer has to be incarnational, grounded and rooted in the family of earth, laughing together and being sensitive to where we hurt together. It means paying attention to everything that's going on around us. If we as men aren't brokenhearted at what grieves around us today, we are not paying attention. And if we aren't breaking into laughter at what God is also doing, we got our eyes shut. The most radical thing any of us can do at this time, says Joanna Macy, that wonderful Buddhist teacher, it's to be fully present to what is happening in the world, being open to the joy and suffering that's within us and that surrounds us, letting it all flow in a green outpouring of the heart. Looking back on all the longings of our lives, what we loved and what we wished we could have changed, how do we let that flow now into the shared longing of the earth? For me, it all comes back to a single tree and a little girl, a place where I've learned to think back through the years of my life, to mourn so readily and take delight so easily. That's where I claim my role as an elder, as a man. May it be so for all of us, brothers.